Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into why things have become so bad for the Jewish people and the world as a whole. Let's get started. This past week was Yom Kippur, which for many of my Jewish followers is a challenging time both spiritually and physically, being that many of us don't eat for 25 hours, and in that time we reflect on our year, what we've been up to, how we can improve ourselves, and all of that amazing stuff that Yom Kippur is meant to symbolize. Yom Kippur is considered one of the holiest days to the Jews, where many Jewish people will refrain from using their phones, from doing anything other than self-reflection, and not think about the stuff that we normally deal with on a day-to-day basis. So on Yom Kippur, it's hard not to be self-reflective, but also reflective of the larger picture of our community as a whole, as we walk past the multiple security guards at your synagogue, or listening to the news about what attack had happened in Israel that day. I'm sure many of my listeners remember the time where everybody in the world was crying out that Israel shouldn't do anything during the month of Ramadan, how disrespectful to the people of Gaza, to the terrorists. It's Ramadan, we should sort of put our weapons down and just take a break for a moment. Of course, this only extends to them, not to us. I didn't hear anybody calling on Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran or any of the anti-Israel groups around the world that came out on Yom Kippur saying, why don't we give the Jews a break? Apparently, the Jewish people don't deserve a break on their holiest day. As I said earlier, the heightened security around every Jewish building in the entire world, along with news of another shooting at a Jewish institution within Canada for the second time this same place was shot at, and the news from Israel that multiple rockets were fired into Israel during Yom Kippur, when the Jewish people are in synagogues and atoning for their own personal sins. Wouldn't it be nice if the people of Hamas and Hezbollah decided to take a minute to reflect on their actions in this world? But nonetheless, this is the plight or the benefit of being a Jew. We are expected to rise above, to not be like them, to be a light unto the nations. And this Yom Kippur, it made me wonder, what's the bigger picture here? What's going on in the world right now? And how is the Jewish community dealing with this situation? Really, how did things get this bad? And how is nobody fixing this? It feels like the Jewish community is yelling into the wind, and no one seems to see what's going on, no one seems to care what's going on, and we are on our own. And I spent some time on Yom Kippur considering this issue. I wanted to start this week's podcast on this somewhat difficult topic with a little bit of a warning or an apology to my Christian followers, my Christian listeners. I mean, no disrespect by any of this, and hopefully you'll understand that this podcast doesn't necessarily go against your beliefs. This is absolutely in no way a criticism of Christianity. This may not necessarily go against your beliefs, but I do want to warn you that I'm not intending on offending anybody. And another small warning I'll give is that I am not a rabbi. I am actually going off of the words of another very learned rabbi, and I'm just sharing sort of his thoughts along with what we're currently seeing and seeing maybe common sense if this is possible, if this is a real thing. But again, I'm not a rabbi, and this is the theory of one or maybe more rabbis that I came across this past week. Getting that all out of the way, now we can get to the fun part of the podcast. When I'm speaking about why things have gotten so bad or how they got so bad, part of me wonders if this is sort of meant to be. There's no real explanation for this. Why is it that things have gotten so bad in Israel, things have gotten so bad in North America? And the reason, according to this rabbi and his theory, is that this is a sign of maybe the coming of the Messiah or the end times or whatever terminology you want to use, and that this is sort of ordained to happen. Things are going to get bad, and it kind of feels like that right now. For any of my listeners who might not be as knowledgeable about the history of Judaism or Jewish tradition, or if you're Christian, maybe also you might not know a whole bunch about the Messiah other than Jesus himself. And so one thing that we believe in Judaism is that there is a Messiah coming. Christians took that to be Jesus, whereas the Jews have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah, as many of you know. But the idea in Judaism is that there are always messiahs in the world. Every generation has a messiah figure that comes, and if they don't fulfill the prophecies that are required for a messiah to do, things like ending all wars and bringing sort of the end time Garden of Eden, beautiful heaven-like world that eventually hopefully will come. But not all generations are ready or fit the criteria for the Messiah to come. So the concept in Judaism is that every generation will have someone who is able or ready or could be a Messiah figure, but not necessarily become the Messiah because the world isn't ready. And when I was speaking to a follower, I was actually kind of going through this myself and thinking there have been multiple times where a Messiah figure has appeared, according to history. Things like Bar Kokhba, who led a revolt against the Roman Empire in the year 132 CE. At the time, people believed him to be the Messiah because he was bringing about a massive change. He was trying to get rid of the Roman Empire and bring the Jews back to Judaism and bring Israel back to being God's country. Unfortunately, for whatever reason you might believe, the world wasn't ready, the Jewish people didn't repent, whatever it might have been. Unfortunately, he passed away in battle, and the end times didn't come, clearly. But according to this rabbi, one thing that has to happen or will happen before the Messiah shows up is there will be a big, what they call Jacob's trouble. This comes from Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7, if you have a Bible at home and want to read it. And the idea of Jacob's trouble is that, according to this rabbi, some major event is going to happen. Something very bad to the Jewish people that is going to trigger a change in the world, as it may be. And this change will do a number of things. Number one, it will wake the world up in many ways. It'll wake the Jewish people up to turn back to God, to turn back to Israel, to go home to Israel, because many of us have been living in exile for thousands of years. It's also going to affect the non-Jewish people. The non-Jewish people are going to see the suffering of the Jews and realize, wow, something is wrong here. And they're going to turn to the Jews and support the Jews. And contrarily, in this end times scenario, there are also going to be people who turn completely against Israel and the Jews, who want to destroy Israel and the Jews. This rabbi points out a very interesting point, which I never actually considered myself, but it seems very accurate to the times. When he says the end times will come, and people will sort of pick sides between supporting the Jewish people and not supporting the Jewish people, he implies that it seems very clear that you're going to have two very separate sides, black or white. There is no gray area here. And he points out that today, that kind of seems like the way it is. If you think about it and you ask someone, what's your opinion on Israel and the Jews? Almost everybody has a very steadfast position, even if they're very uneducated on it. Some people will stand with the Jews and say, I support Israel's right to exist and for the Jews to not be harassed and murdered in the streets. And then there are others who say, well, they're colonizers and occupiers and they kind of deserve what they're getting and they don't deserve a state in Israel. And there's not tons of people that will sort of sit in the middle. And as this rabbi points out, October 7th seems to fit that bill. A major incident that happens in Israel that the world looks at and the Jews come together as a whole and the non-Jews see the plight of the Jewish people. I know some of the listeners on this podcast who have contacted me have said, I had no idea about all of this stuff before October 7th. It was only because of October 7th that I was seeking out things like your podcast or information on Israel and on the Jewish people. People who now stand with Israel only because of October 7th. That day was this Jacob's trouble, according to this rabbi, that turned everybody either for or against Israel and the Jews. And not only has it brought the non-Jewish people back into the fold, but many Jewish people themselves who had no connection to Judaism before October 7th have now started to wear kippot, have started wearing Jewish stars, started going to synagogue, like on Yom Kippur, for example. There are tons of articles written about the increased attendance in synagogues all over the world of Jews who want to participate in Judaism and get reconnected to their faith. There are even people who run conversion classes for non-Jews that say that the numbers are off the charts of people who want to turn to Judaism for the first time ever. People have turned towards Judaism again, which is something that apparently is going to happen towards the end times. And in addition to that, we've actually seen another part of these prophecies coming true, which is that the Jewish people will return to Israel in large numbers, which is something that we are actually seeing today due to the unfortunate situations going on in the West. According to some reports, over 30,000 Jewish people have left the West where it's no longer safe for them to go to Israel. This is what the prophets are saying would happen in the end times. People are not only returning to their Judaism, but they're returning to their homeland in large numbers. So we've seen some of these prophecies seeming to come true. It seems to fit, according to this rabbi anyway. But there's one more thing that he brings up that seems pretty interesting and very accurate to the time. According to the prophet Ezekiel, he speaks about these two organizations called Gog and Magog, which are a conglomerate of different peoples and groups and countries in the region who will attempt to attack the state of Israel or the people of Israel. And this massive war that's going to happen is going to trigger an all-out war between the good and evil, the people who support the Jews and the people who are against the Jews, and this war will lead to the Messiah coming. Some scholars have placed the Gog and Magog in the Arab world, such as places like Iran and some of the surrounding areas. So it does seem to be very apt considering the current conflict between Iran and Israel and Iran's proxies spotted throughout the entire Arab world. We also can't forget the Western allies on college campuses. So as we get more and more into these prophecies, it really seems like things are fitting into place, according to what this rabbi suggests, which is that there will be a very large incident that happens, the October 7th massacre. It will cause everybody around the world to essentially choose sides. You're either with Israel or you're against Israel, which seems very clear on the streets of all Western society at this point. And then Jewish people in response will turn back to God, will go back to Israel, which we're also seeing right now. And then it seems like a very large conflict might happen between Iran and other Arab nations against the state of Israel. And this all-out war will possibly bring about a Messiah who's going to solve this conflict once and for all. Now, I'll be honest, I'm a scholar, an academic. It's a little hard to believe this stuff knowing the history of how many people claimed messiahship at some point in history, but it never panned out. And therefore, is this just yet another time where someone's making some things fit in order to make it seem like this is the end times? We've heard Christian preachers say that for many, many years. We've had a few Jewish messiahs that didn't pan out. For example, take a look at Shabtai Tzvi in the Ottoman Empire in the 1600s, who claimed messiahhood. People believed he was the Messiah, but he didn't bring out any of the things that a Messiah would have to bring out, and then ended up converting forcibly to Islam, which is a whole other thing. But the worse things get right now, it's kind of getting harder and harder to understand why things are getting this bad. On Yom Kippur, we're sitting here and looking into self-reflection. What can I do better next time? But meanwhile, the world around us seems to be crumbling, and I really don't understand why. I'm sure many of you are feeling the same way. So I don't know if this theory is true, or if this is another Bar Kokhba or Shabtai Tzvi situation. In the end, I know this Yom Kippur might have been a little bit challenging for people with the conflict going on in the world, with all of the personal struggles you're dealing with. And I guess the hope for this podcast is to show you that maybe this is not all for nothing. Maybe with some faith in God, things happen the way they're supposed to happen, and trust in the process. If we are to believe this theory by this rabbi, that all of these things are falling into place, where we are going to see the end times maybe within a lifetime, maybe Mashiach will come now, I don't know. But to be honest, it's getting harder and harder to understand and rationalize the fact that we are living in this situation. We haven't seen this situation since World War II. And in an interesting conversation I had with one of my followers, we talked about the fact that maybe the Holocaust was an October 7th-like situation where the world was supposed to wake up to the situation that the Jews were facing. The world was supposed to stop being anti-Semitic and murdering Jews. This was never supposed to happen again. And amazingly, if you think about it, following World War II, the people of Israel got together and created a state. And people started flooding back to Israel, just like we see right now. So maybe that time was a possibility of having the Messiah show up. But for whatever reason, the world just never changed. The non-Jewish people who were persecuting Jews didn't get the message. There are some people in the Chabad movement that believed that their rabbi or their Rebbe was someone who could have been the Messiah. And he lived through the Holocaust and was in America following the Holocaust. And people believe that maybe after the Holocaust, the state of Israel being established, people heading back to Israel, he brought a lot of Jewish people back into Judaism, as all the prophecies suggest. But maybe for some reason the world wasn't ready for a Messiah, and therefore he didn't fulfill that prophecy. So I guess at the end of this podcast, what I'm trying to say is, for this Yom Kippur, while we reflect on ourselves, maybe we should also consider the fact that the world as a whole needs to change. The world as a whole needs to end this anti-Semitism, needs to end the violence against Jews. And I know all of you don't have podcasts, don't have a ton of friends that you can talk to about this stuff. Maybe you don't feel safe to talk to people about this stuff, which is part of the problem. But in whatever little way you have, whatever tiny platform of very close and trusted friends who might not be Jewish, or even Jewish people that you know that you want to help make them feel safe and connected to their Judaism again, any little thing we can do to make this world a better place, because to be honest, it's all we can do. I don't control the prophecies, I don't control God, I don't control the Messiah. What I control is myself. And maybe this podcast and the people who are listening to it might have a little spark of hope that even though things have never felt worse right now, that maybe it's for a reason. Maybe it's a sign to you to work that little bit harder in your own self-reflection or in helping others be reflective of what's going on in the world today. There are so many ways to get involved, from little tiny ways in your own personal life, like donating to a charity, like lighting a Shabbat candle that you've never lit before, or speaking to friends to tell them what is going on in your life. Maybe when the non-Jewish friends that you have hear about all the struggles that you're going through, they'll become an ally for you and with the Jewish people. Or maybe you have bigger ambitions. Maybe you can join a synagogue. Maybe you can become part of a synagogue. Maybe you can plan a trip to Israel if you've never been. I don't know how we got here, but maybe there is a purpose to it. Maybe there's a reason why we are here and having to suffer through this situation, to be the light unto the nations like we were expected to be. Let's not let this October 7th situation allow the world to fall back into old habits, fall back into the anti-Semitism and the hate that we are seeing on the streets today. Maybe things have gotten this bad because we, as Jewish people, have stopped being the light unto the nations. Maybe we have stopped telling other people what we're dealing with, so they can't empathize with us. Maybe we're not being vocal enough at our town councils and our governments to tell them what we're facing and to demand changes. Hopefully this podcast may have given you a little bit of hope that all of this pain and anguish is not for nothing. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.